Today, we're going to talk about why resisting pornography is a bad idea.
Should be interesting.
So pornography is running rampant through our society right now. People are getting more addicted to pornography than they've ever been before. And there are a lot of good neuroscientific reasons for this. Pornography is getting more visual. We have VR pornography, higher resolution pornography. Everything is getting brighter, bouncier, jigglier, right? And then we also have this whole parasocial angle, which has never existed before. In the past, when you were looking at pornography, like when I was growing up, there were things like magazines. And they don't even move, which is one thing, but they certainly don't interact with you, right? And now what we have is things like OnlyFans or other platforms where you can interact with a pornographic content creator and you can form a relationship with them.
So I have to pause every time Dr. K talks about this. I just think it's worth highlighting. This is a licensed psychiatrist who can diagnose addiction, talking about the realities of pornography addiction, probably not from what he was educated on, but just from seeing so many people struggle with it, the nature of how they struggle, to the point now that he is obviously able to explain this with neuroscience and then these parasocial examples. So it's just worth talking about because everybody says like, oh, we don't know if pornography is actually a real addiction. The addiction models are different for alcohol and drugs than they are for porn. All that stuff is true. And at the same time, you have somebody here who's very, very reliable, really does his research, and is still licensed and practicing, who's saying this is a real addiction. I think that's worth noting.
And this can all become very addicting. But there's one thing that we're actually screwing up, which is quite paradoxical. So as people try to conquer pornography, improve their relationship with it, maybe get rid of the addiction, one of the biggest mistakes that they make is trying to resist it. Now, I know that sounds absolutely insane, but in order to understand this, we have to understand sort of the neuroscience and clinical perspective on cravings resistance, and also how we ultimately, in addiction psychiatry, overcome something like an addiction. So let's take a quick look at what happens when you actually try to resist a craving. So anytime your brain wants something, right, it starts by trying to entice you. So it says like, hey man, like let's get high, like let's have a good time. It's fun, it's the weekend, maybe it's not quite the weekend, it's a Monday and it's been a hard day and oh, the weekend wasn't quite as fun as you thought. You know, it'll come up with whatever it can to try to get you to use. And then if you say no, the addiction is like, now I'm feeling jittery. Come on, bro, like let's take the edge off. Just take the edge off a little bit, right? Like we don't have to party the whole way. Like, let's just take the edge off. Let's just try to do this. It'll help us work. It'll help us go meet our friends. Like the rest of the day will be good. Like, come on, man, like let's take away a little bit of this negativity. Let's move towards positivity. And then if you say no, then the brain starts getting pissed.
Okay, I just want to pause here. This is such a good explanation of what happens when you try to remove something that your brain or your body are really dependent on. I want to just translate this for somebody who's addicted to pornography because he's using a different example. But with pornography, the urges intensify, but then your brain does try very like low-key ways to still get a bit of a hit, whether it's fantasy, checking someone out. Sometimes it's even getting into your phone. You go to old flings or old content. There's like your brain gets very creative. And the other thing that's really common, and this is true when people recover, like our clients usually experience this probably around the 2 to 3 week mark, which is they get a lot of wet dreams or sort of like when they're in these unconscious states, their brain still tries to get the hit. It still tries to create something that mimics pornography and mimics the release. So this is spot on. We've definitely seen this. We've served a lot of guys over the years. I mean, we're talking thousands, and all of them would resonate and they would say, yeah, I went through this. And I know even when I was quitting, very, very similar experience.
Oh, like now I'm going to give you withdrawal, right? You feel this withdrawal. We've got headaches. We've got stomach aches. We've got whole body pain. We're going to have a little bit of diarrhea. And then if you still white knuckle it, if you resist, then your brain gets angry at you, says, bitch, what do you think you're doing? We need this stuff. I told you we need this stuff. Look at how much we're hurting now. Now the headache intensifies. Now you have diarrhea. Now you're vomiting. And then ultimately, if you end up giving in, what your brain kind of says is like, why do you make me do this to you, man? Like, why do you have to make me hurt you so much in order to get what we need, right? It's just like hunger and thirst to your brain, where if you deprive your body, it starts to punish you. It literally sends you negative signals, not positive signals.
Okay, so very interesting point. I can kind of see where he's going. I'm not going to assume anything because he's Dr. K. You never know what you're going to get. But the one thing I will say is that point, like that breaking point where your brain is really pissed at you and you do give in, it's very similar to, there was like this experiment with the rats. Maybe you've heard it before, but just very quick. They wanted to see like how long could a rat survive if it was just put into a bucket of water. So they take the rat, they put in a bucket of water, they time it, and the average length it survived was about 12 minutes, something like that. So after 12 minutes, the rat, he keeps trying to swim around, he can't get out, he gives up, he drowns. And so what they start to do then in the second round of experiments is they took the rats, put them in the bucket, and just when the rats start to give away, boom, they grabbed it, they saved it, they dried it off, they kind of let it regulate and calm down, and then they put it back in the bucket. And they thought maybe if it got a taste of, being rescued, it would swim a bit longer. And it turns out it didn't just swim a little bit longer, it actually swam for, I think on average it was like 50 hours. It was more than a day. It was an absurd amount. And so the point here is when your brain is on these breaking points, this is in the opposite direction because this is positive, but when your brain is at these breaking points, if you rescue it, like if you're almost there and then you rescue it, your brain holds on to that memory and it will push a lot further. So a lot of people actually sabotage their recoveries right at this breaking point because they end up giving in, and then their brain says, as long as I push hard enough and long enough, at some point you're going to give in and you're going to give me what I want. And that's why a lot of people stay stuck in these addiction cycles and they can't figure it out. It's because they don't push past these hard moments. Now, I don't think that's where he's going in this video, but that is where I stand on it. It is one way to do it. It's not the only way, as we're about to find out.
It punishes you for not giving it what it wants. And so I'm kind of reminded, trigger warning, of a South Park episode where there's some domestic violence, but this is literally what I see. One of my patients mentioned this episode to me, and he said, "This is what it feels like when I resist a craving. I feel like my brain starts punishing me for fighting it in the first place." And so this is a weird challenge because what ends up happening is as we resist cravings, our brain begins to learn what kind of signals do I need to send to this dumbass to get what I want. And so the real paradoxical thing that we see in addiction is that the more patients resist and fail, the more intensive their cravings become. So this is what's really different about addiction, right? Because if we look at most things in life, as we fight against things, even if we lose, we get better over time. So if I go to the gym and I lift a bunch of weight and I can't lift, let's say, this high amount of weight, the next time I go to the gym, I'll be better at it. My muscles will grow. My muscles will adapt, right? If I play chess over time, I'll get better at it. I'll get better at swimming. I'll get better at reading. I'll get better at studying. I'll understand more mathematics, more calculus. But addiction is the one interesting thing where the more that you fight it, the worse off you become. So if you look at the cycle of addiction, after years and years and years of people resisting cravings, being sober for a while, relapsing, and then you're kind of back on this treadmill over and over again.
So this is a really good point, and he is right, but there is a caveat, right? Because he's saying this is why people who try and fail end up not getting any better. So he's right about that, but when people try and they're successful or they can move the needle forward, there's some sort of progression happening. It can actually be a little bit more similar to, learning chess or that sort of thing where your brain is actually developing and it is learning. But again, these are things that you often can't do on your own. That's why you need a community or you need a professional guide, or ideally you have both, that are kind of leading you through this process, explaining what's going on, because otherwise he's right. You just end up, you push, you fail, and then it gets harder to push and recover again in the future.
Despite the fact that people who struggle with addictions have a ton of experience, their life seems to be moving in the wrong direction. And why is that? It's because of this principle of if you resist a craving and end up giving in, your brain learns this is the signal that I send to this person in order to get what I need. So your brain starts paradoxically amplifying the cravings because it knows that I need to go straight to a high level so that we can skip all these first steps, because this is what gets me what I need. And this isn't just your brain doing this in the case of addictions. We even do this normally. For example, if you have a family member who's deaf, right? You start by calling their name. You're like, "Hey, buddy," and they don't hear you. And then you raise the volume. You say, "Hey, buddy." They don't hear you. And then if they're deaf, you start yelling, and that's when they hear you. If you do that a couple times, your brain will stop talking to them in a normal voice. It'll realize what signal it needs to create to get the response that it wants. And it's not just the case of deafness. We also see this in sort of getting our psychological needs met. So sometimes we'll see this very commonly as psychiatrists with kids. So if a kid is getting bullied at school, they'll start complaining about stomach aches. And it's not that they're faking it. It's that what happens with this child is I'm being bullied at school. I go to my parents and I say, hey, I don't want to go to school today, and they don't listen. But the one day that I have a stomach ache, they let me stay home. So our brain is learning, and the child isn't even consciously aware. They can be 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old. And then the body will actually create physiologic stomach aches.
This is also what makes porn addiction so debilitating, right? Because you start with watching something that's probably relatively mundane. That's kind of how it starts for all of us. It seems pretty innocent. It's crossing the line. It's nothing crazy. But then eventually that doesn't really satisfy, right? The stimulation's not enough. It's not sending enough of a signal. So then you start to watch, for me, like I went from looking at pictures to watching videos. That transition happened when I was watching pornography. But in today's day and age, it would be from, watching more softcore stuff to watching more hardcore stuff. And then eventually that, is kind of, it peters off. So then the signal that's required has to become more profound, more intense, more sharp, et cetera, and eventually you start to escalate it. So that dynamic he's explaining is actually what causes pornography addiction. But what makes pornography addiction so bad is the dulling that happens. It's like, imagine, we'll go with his example. You're talking to the deaf person in your family, and when you yell at, let's call it an 8 out of 10, then you get their attention. But then their hearing gets a little bit worse like a year later, and now an 8 out of 10 doesn't get their attention, so you have to yell at a 9 out of 10, and so on and so forth. So that escalation is what keeps us coming back to pornography, and it's what makes it so addictive in the first place.
So our brain is designed to get needs met. And paradoxically, if you try to resist cravings and fail, your brain will intensify the cravings to get what it needs. So this is where you're probably saying, well, what are you saying, Dr. K? Should I just watch porn anytime I feel like it? Should I just give into it completely? Because I've tried that and that doesn't work. So instead of just randomly resisting the craving and then ultimately giving into it, which will intensify the craving the next time you step into the ring, what we really want to do is almost schedule our pornography use. So one of the things that I'll do with my patients is sort of pick 2 times throughout the day where they are allowed to watch pornography. This has a very interesting effect. The first is that outside of those windows, it becomes easier to resist. But even then, they're resisting a little bit. It becomes easier to win the battle of pushing the pornography until 11 a.m. and 6 p.m., let's say. At 8 or 9 in the morning, you get this little impulse and you kind of push it till 11 a.m. So you're actually strengthening and training your frontal lobe. And then when 11 a.m. rolls around, you can sort of engage in it. So this is really interesting because we can't do this with a substance use disorder. And why is that? Because in a substance use disorder, we have certain genetic modifications usually to things like our GABA receptors, our mu receptors, which mean that if I have a little bit of alcohol at 11 a.m., the rest of my day is shot. Thankfully, the pattern that I tend to see in behavioral addictions is that moderation is more accessible. It's more doable. So with someone like an alcohol addict, you can't really do that. If they have one drink, they can't stop. With pornography addicts, I'm able to see more success in this way. So I know it sounds really bizarre, but just setting aside a particular time where you're allowed to watch pornography.
I'm not sure about that. I can't deny if he's seen some success, that is what it is. So you may not know this about me, but I was addicted to pornography for 15 years. I can tell you this would have never worked for me, because if you gave me an inch, I would take a mile. And sure, I know that, I'm going to get it again tomorrow and whatever. But for me, pornography was so euphoric and so exhilarating. I don't think that strategy would have ever worked. Now, a couple things that I want to just comment on here. Number one, the one thing that Dr. K and I would definitely agree on is that quitting cold turkey is usually ineffective because you're making your entire progress and outcome about resisting the thing. And when the thing is the focus or it's the object of your goal, you're going to naturally move towards it. And so he explained all the neuroscience behind it, which is that your brain just escalates until it gets what it wants. And if you have a history of caving in at some point, your brain knows it's just going to intensify and escalate things so that you just keep giving in and keep giving in. That's all true. But at the same time, a lot of guys who quit cold turkey, it's all about white knuckling. It's all about resisting the thing. and then that thing becomes bigger than it needs to be. So I think we're united on that front. The other thing I would say is, in our approach, like in my deep clean method, which is the process I've walked thousands of guys through now to successfully quit porn, the thing that we observe is if we don't really pay a lot of attention to when you're watching, how often you're watching, but we actually just focus on the underlying causes, what's causing this. Usually it's one of three things. It's a lack of emotional regulation, it's trauma, or it's limiting beliefs, it's bad thinking, that kind of stuff. If we just focus on that and we try to unearth the roots, tackle them, and we don't really pay much attention, like we'll do some tracking, we'll definitely pay attention to it to some degree, but we're not making it the focus. All of a sudden the trends start to change. Not because we set periodic times where you can watch, not because we, really tried to do anything to manipulate or control the behavior. We just got to the cause. We kind of went a little bit further upstream, and naturally the behavior starts to change. And that's actually kind of similar to this approach. It's obviously mechanistically it's different, but basically we're saying the same thing, which is stop trying to just resist the thing. Don't make it about avoiding it and resisting it. You need an approach that's going to be a little bit more effective for you to concentrate on the things that really matter. And that's the only thing I don't really like about this approach is somebody who's watching pornography and they have their two blocks of the day where they're going to watch. I mean, that was my addiction. Like when I was really addicted to pornography, I was a university researcher. I was studying as well. I was completing my education. I volunteered working with children with autism. I had a part-time job and I volunteered at my church on the weekends. I wasn't watching pornography 24/7 because I didn't have time to. But I had 2 points in the day that I literally scheduled my whole day around. And those were the most exciting parts of the day for me, is when I got to go watch pornography. So that system actually became very rewarding for me and the thing I looked forward to, and it kept me addicted for a really long time. So that's why I don't like this approach, even though I do see like the weaning. But I would say an even better way to do this, where you don't have to kind of structure it, you don't have to gradually wean off something that you know is really toxic, is just getting to the roots. Have a roots-based approach. Focus on the roots, concentrate your energy there, and then naturally downstream, the behaviors will begin to change. And like I said earlier, if you do this in the context of healthy community, guys that are supporting you, going through the same thing, and you have a guide like Dr. K or like myself that's guiding you through this, making sure that you're not making any of those mistakes along the way, keeping you on course, you can actually start to see a pretty radical change in a relatively short period of time. So if you're struggling with pornography, maybe you've been struggling a long time, or you're just getting started on the journey and you don't know where to start or you don't even know who to talk to, hit me up on Instagram. My handle is SathiaMeSam. My DMs are always open. I love speaking with you guys, giving you resources, or just figuring out what I can do to help and support you. SathiaMeSam is the handle. Check me out over there, send me a message, and let's see what we can do.